Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Tony and Sven for inviting me. I very much enjoyed reading the book. The book sets out to do three things, and it seems to me it does them very effectively. The first one, the book explains the origins of the sovereign debt crisis in the euro area and is focusing on the political causes of the crisis as well as the economic causes of the crisis. And it does that by going back actually to the negotiation of the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, or the Treaty on the European Union, and what I call the original problems with the setup of EMU. The second objective of the book is to explain the delayed and fragmented response of the euro area or the European Union to the sovereign debt crisis, and it focuses on the European Central Bank, the European Commission, and also discusses the response from the main member states, particularly France, Germany, and to some extent Italy. And then the third objective of the book is actually to put forward some proposal for some innovative reform of economic governance in economic and monetary union. Now, there are 3 points which I found very interesting in the book. The first one is what I call the original sin of economic and monetary union. And I think this metaphor is very appropriate since we are in a church. So what is the original sin of economic and monetary union? Was the setting up of a full monetary union, monetary policy run by the European Central Bank in Frankfurt for the entire euro area, but then there was not a full economic union. It was only a partial economic union. There were some rules about fiscal policy, but not what the French call gouvernement économique. Indeed, during the negotiation of the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, there was some discussion about setting up a sort of counterpower to the European Central Bank, an economic government. This was not done, and that's why we have an asymmetric economic and monetary union with a full monetary union and an underdeveloped economic union. Why was this problematic? Because this setup somehow assumed a very optimistic view of how EMU would work. So somehow assumed that macroeconomic imbalances in an economic and monetary union would fade away, that different degrees of competitiveness across countries would be self-corrected within economic and monetary union, giving up the instrument of adjustment of the exchange rate. This was not the case, and indeed macroeconomic imbalances were one of the main causes of the sovereign debt crisis, and I want to come back to this point in a second. The other problem of an asymmetric economic and monetary union is that there was an over-optimistic view of the disciplining power of financial market. So the assumption was that within an economic and monetary union, financial markets, financial investors would be able to distinguish between countries which had a very sound fiscal policy, such as Germany, and countries which had a less sound fiscal policy, such as Greece and Italy. And the idea is that in so doing, they would be able to rein in the borrowing of countries which didn't have a sound fiscal policy. This was not the case. The other interesting point which is made in the book is what I call the dispelling the myth of the sovereign debt crisis as a fiscal crisis. Now, in most of the journalistic narrative, in particular in Germany, and I'm saying that because I spent the last 2 years in Germany on research leave, but as well in the media in the UK and other countries, the sovereign debt crisis is mostly presented as a fiscal crisis, as a problem of peripheral countries, Southern European countries, which borrow too much. That is partly the case, but this was not the main cause of the crisis. The fiscal crisis of this euro area crisis was mainly a balance of payment crisis. It was originated by macroeconomic imbalances in the euro area. Perhaps the only countries which had almost a domestic fiscal crisis were Greece, and to some extent, if you want to include in this group, Italy as well, which had domestic fiscal policy, which had a very high public debt even prior to EMU, which had a rather high public deficit prior to EMU, and also once they joined EMU, so without consolidating the public finance. Third interesting point of the book is that the book tells us two narratives about the sovereign debt crisis. So, to some extent, it tells us the narrative from the perspective of debtor countries, by which I mean Germany, Finland, Austria, the Netherlands. And for the debtor countries, so at least from their perspective, the Eurozone crisis was mainly a fiscal crisis, was due to the lack of fiscal consolidation in Southern European countries, was due to the lack of structural reform in the periphery of Europe, the inability to compete in an efficient way in the single market, and therefore they often articulate in the domestic debate the concern of a moral hazard. The idea that if you intervene, if you bail the country out now, they might do so in the future. So basically, the blame, quote unquote, is with countries which borrowed too much, that did not adjust to life in economic and monetary union. The book also tells us the story from the perspective of debtor countries. So for debtor countries, the main blame rests with countries which had a permanent surplus in the balance of payment, first and foremost Germany, which exports much more than it imports, and therefore this is partly due to the low domestic demand in Germany. They would also point out the capital inflows which flew from creditor countries onto the periphery of Europe prior to the sovereign debt crisis. And to some extent, they would also argue that national authorities in this country, in the southern European countries, including also Ireland, so periphery country, were unable to control some of these capital inflows. And once the global financial crisis came about, once the sovereign debt crisis started, then there were massive outflows from the periphery countries into the creditor countries. And this was also worsening the balance of payment. So basically, it seems to me, but David will tell us more about this, that David somehow is quite balanced in assigning, quote-unquote, the blame. So he's saying, well, actually, there were some problems with the policies of creditor countries and problems with the policies of debtor countries. The final point, it seems to me also the book provides a very critical view about the lack of a political leadership in the European Union. And there is a sentence which I would like to quote because I was actually quite, I find it very somewhat depressing or worrisome, and is the euro has turned out to be a currency for which nobody is responsible. And I think perhaps it is a message which is coming out from the book. Final 3 points, very briefly, what could be improved in the book? Well, the first one is that the book is written in a very narrative way, in a very sort of straightforward way, but still at certain points it assumes some background knowledge. In particular, for example, the discussion of the balance of payment, which is a very complex matter, is dealt with in a very simple way, in a very straightforward way, but unless the reader has some background knowledge about macroeconomic imbalances, that might be difficult to follow. Second point, perhaps with reference at least to some periphery countries, I would emphasize a little bit more the banking crisis, which was one of the components of the sovereign debt crisis. So balance of payment crisis, in some countries fiscal crisis, but also banking crisis, in particular in Spain and Ireland, where the banking crisis then became a fiscal crisis because then the state first had to bail out domestic banks, and then the European Union and the IMF had to bail out Spain and Ireland. Final point, the reform which are put forward, reform proposals which are suggested at the end of the book, they are very innovative, so that's the positive side. I just wonder whether politically they are feasible or not. So they are quite, quite substantial or forward-looking.
Okay, well, I'm very pleased also to be able to comment on David's book. I'm going to give my views in a slightly different way. Lucia set out what the book tries to do. Let me take a different tack on things. What struck me when David sent me the proofs of the book electronically, and I sat down, read the introduction, and found that I had to sit and read a lot, was first of all that it wasn't this book. This book's David's previous book on the Euro, the Politics of the New Global Currency, and it's a rather different book. We might call it more scholarly. I think there's about 40 pages of footnotes, whereas I think there are 2 in the current book. So it's a bit more in the academic mode, but still called by George Soros amazingly detailed and thoroughly readable. He completed that book, David, in 2008, and it was already clear about the dangers inherent in the euro. I'll just give you one quote from David in the final chapter, The Reckoning. The one-size-fits-all monetary policy provides policymakers with instruments that can be used with great benefit, but they need to be handled with care. If the tools are misused or passed into the wrong hands, they can lead to self-harm, if not fatality. So you find in this book prescient words, not only from David, but also from the key players, because you quote extensively from key players. Dominic Strauss-Kahn, for instance, who's no longer a key player, at least not in this area of activity, then managing director of the IMF. He proclaimed the need for changing the euro because of the weaknesses that have been highlighted by the financial crisis. He said, I know of no country that has a currency but with no finance minister in charge of that currency. We have a very strong central bank, but in front of that, no real person in charge of the economy. It is very difficult to make decisions without centralised power. Well, he was proven correct on that. Or former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who says, now that Germany has gone through a difficult time, lowered its costs and recovered competitiveness, the other countries have to do the same. There is no way that Germany is going to produce significantly more inflation to help out the others. Well, we've heard that kind of view, although from the other side of the party political spectrum. And reading this book, you get a strong sense that the Eurozone crisis was perhaps less of a surprise than the general global financial crisis. Coming back to the current book, that's an authoritative book. It's written in a less academic style and more to the point charts the Eurozone's actual self-harm that David warned about before the crisis had emerged in Greece. So in that sense, it's the sequel to this more chunky book. The second thing that I was struck by with the book is the way in which many, if not all, of the potential solutions that David outlines are revealed to be problematic. That increased German spending might appear a way to float the Eurozone off the rocks, Eurozone economy off the rocks, but it's unlikely to happen because it would be completely out of character for German policymakers. It might lead Germany to breach the fiscal compact, and tax cuts in Germany often lead to more savings than spending, so it wouldn't actually work even if it happened, which it won't. So that's the kind of story that we get. The banking union, which we're moving towards now, might put the European Central Bank into a conflict of interest with its monetary role. We hear of German reluctance, Franco-German impotence, Anglo-Saxon ambivalence, and Asian incredulity, European incompetence. William Hague might find the book corroborating his description of the euro area as a burning building with no exits, and we really see little prospects for the future other than muddling through. What I liked about the book strongly was the centrality afforded to analysis of the German position. Of course, as somebody who works on Germany and the EU, that's partly personal preference, but Germany is the indispensable player in the crisis, so we hear from Helmut Kohl to his protégé Angela Merkel, through successive Bundesbank presidents to the current incumbent, Jens Weidmann, who's, of course, challenging some of the measures taken by the European Central Bank before the Federal Constitute in Germany. So there's an interesting story there. Germany is really central, and its apparent strength economically is matched by a range of domestic weaknesses, not least a sceptical public. But other states are in focus, including Cyprus, Italy, France, and the Asian perspective. 10-point plan I found very interesting. Actually, I got via a mutual acquaintance of us the German version of this book before the English language version. I was somewhat puzzled that this 10-point plan was not in the German version. Surely they want to know what the solution is, but I gather that was the English publishers, the American publishers' stipulation. It's a very readable book with occasional humour as well, literary references, outright monetary transactions, David points out, are neither monetary nor outright, and there be no transactions. This is a sort of humour that you pick up. So overall, it's an excellent analysis of the cause of the crisis and offers a sobering prognosis for its eventual resolution. Tony asked both of us to say what we thought could possibly be done better, and I just want to highlight 3 points about that. He's got a chapter on the technocrats in the European Central Bank and the European Commission who stumble. What he said a bit less about was the endless and almost invariably inconclusive meetings of the European Council, a kind of soap opera in a sense, as successive leaders get voted out of office, leaving only Angela Merkel, it would appear, as the constant. The second thing I thought was the geographical coverage of it was slightly unusual. I mean, you didn't cover, for instance, Ireland and Portugal, but focused more on Cyprus. It brought out the points, but it was a slightly odd balance between those countries. You bring out the banking dimension via Cyprus when it had come out first via Ireland, I think. And one final point. I mean, you've written a lot on Germany and Europe, and given the central role that you attribute to Germany in the crisis and its solution or non-solution, one thing that I didn't pick up in the German role in it was the role of its banks, who must, I think, bear some complicity in the running up of debt, bonds they held in southern Europe, and which, as one of an academic colleague, Helen Thompson from Cambridge University, gave a paper on this in the politics department. She's a blogger for Sperry, pointed out that conveniently these German banks had divested themselves of many of those bonds by the time the second Greek bailout came, which seems a bit of a coincidence given the haircut that some of the private bondholders had to take in that settlement. So I'd certainly like to hear a little bit more about the role of German banks as possible contributors to the crisis in their own right.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here in this extraordinary ecclesiastical setting, where I do hope the organ will be playing at some stage, just to give us a reasonably sonorous backcloth to this discussion. It is, I think, a very sobering story, and I thank Simon and Lucia very much for putting it into some kind of overall context. I will also answer one or two of those points about the banks. But I also think, given the interdisciplinary nature of what Sperry does, that it does repay some study, because this is such a fascinatingly interwoven story, and it is a whole collection of stories, basically, where the guilt of Germany for having been the instigator, certainly of the Second World War, and many would say the First World War, the hang-ups, the complexes that France has had vis-à-vis Germany, the whole nagging pains of post-war Europe, which has afterwards been a great success, but has still left behind some residues of sin or failings or criminality in the past. All of those things these historical, cultural, political issues play a huge role, and they're interwoven against these immensely fascinating, often horrendously complicated economic and financial topics. And I do try to make some literary references as well, as Simon was pointing out. So again, this lends itself, I think, to an interdisciplinary approach. One of the analogies that I use is that we are now entering into a situation where there is gridlock. Almost anything you want to put forward has got some problems to it. It's as though we've got some kind of Heath Robinson type of contraption. And as soon as you tinker with one part of the engine, something else happens in another part of the contraption, another part of the engine, which countermands the first adjustment you've been trying to make. And I won't go into all the details, but there are very, very many instances of that. For instance, in the question of the banking union, which has just come up again recently, having been one of the subjects that wasn't actually properly tackled on this in the last 20 or 30 years. So I think it does repay this interdisciplinary approach, which I know is very much part of the Sperry angle that you have here. And the psychology of this as well is fascinating. I make the remark in one part of the book that it would have been a lot better had the book, had the treaty not been in Maastricht, but had it been in Vienna, the birthplace of Sigmund Freud, because without a grasp of the psychology of Europe and this nagging pain that the German sins of the past have maybe still not been quite requited, I don't think it's quite possible to understand also the moral hold, some might call it blackmail, that the debtor countries still have over the creditor countries. As Lucia said, it is a narrative written also to try to separate out the viewpoints of the creditors and the debtors. And this is one of the literary allusions that I make, that the deadlock we are now in, it seems to be somewhat akin to parts of the 1984 fabric of George Orwell's novel, where you're looking at a long-running, rather low-level belligerency between these three future states who are all globally at war with each other. Nobody quite understands how the war started. Nobody knows how the war is developing. Nobody knows how it's going to end, apart from the fact that there will be no real victors. And it's this dull, constant thud of low-level belligerency between the debtors and the creditors, which I think still marks out the narrative that we have today. And I'll try to say a few words about what I think will happen next, but I think it is also very necessary to draw out a few points about the past. And so without trying to reproduce what colleagues have said already, I would like to just say why the euro was formed to start with. Four big reasons. To say what has gone wrong and why none of those four aims have actually been fulfilled. And also to try to draw out some lessons which I hope are of interest to students not only of economics and finance and politics, but also maybe students of human nature. There probably is quite a lot of anthropology here somewhere as well, lurking behind all this. I have to say I'm an expert in none of these things, but I clearly do take an interdisciplinary approach. And as was said from the CV that Tony read out, that really is just a sign I'll never be able to hold down a proper job. So, in terms of the four main reasons why this took place, one was certainly to try to bring about a spirit of political rapprochement between Germany and France after the wars and the enmity of the last 200 or 300 years. Another one was to complete the single market. There was a very strong economic aspect of this, and this was the Jacques Delors approach during the 1980s. Which of course Mrs. Thatcher signed up to. Mrs. Thatcher was the British architect of part of the single market, the idea that you needed a single currency in order that people would trade with each other and ideas and capital and people and goods would pass freely across borders. The single currency was all part of that. Third reason, this is where America comes in. There was a strong feeling by the Europeans that the dollar shouldn't be allowed to get away with its monopoly position. Hegemony of the dollar was thought of as something, for different reasons, that both France and Germany wanted to combat. the Germans on the whole for slightly more moralistic, Calvinistic reasons, and the French because they would like some of that monopoly privilege themselves. And then the fourth point was, of course, about Germany. This is where the centrality of Germany does come in. That the pre-narrative for the euro, of course, is set long, long ago. You could say it goes back to the Roman Empire. But the law plan was hatched in 1988, 1989, several months before the Berlin Wall fell. But the real catalyst to speed up something which maybe was already underway and to give it extra form, extra tenacity was clearly the fall of the Berlin Wall and the prospect of Germany becoming united very quickly. And this certainly sped up the idea, which was held by many nations, many national leaders, that Germany would somehow become preeminent and dominant again. And the Germans were only too willing to give up the badge of that potential dominance, the D-mark. Very interestingly, they gave up both the badge and the emblem of that post-war resurgence. And they also gave up the lever, which was arguably one of the reasons for unification. The East Germans wanted the stability and the strength and the prosperity that they felt went with the D-mark. So the greatest prize, but also the instrument of unification, was the D-mark, and the Germans freely gave that up. They threw that into the crucible in a kind of Tolkien-esque way, and the ring thrown into the furnace. It was an act of self-sacrifice, quite biblical in lots of ways. The Germans did this freely. The political parties, 95% of the political parties in the Bundestag wholly believed, as did Chancellor Kohl, that giving up the D-mark, turning into the euro, turning the Bundesbank into the ECB was an essential act of self-sacrifice through which Europe would be made whole and free. This was all about actually curbing what was thought of as being another bout of German resurgence. If you look at those four motivations quite briefly and objectively, then I firmly believe that a political rapprochement between France and Germany, although still there on paper, is actually less in sight in the true sense of some kind of political union between France and Germany than it has been at any period in the last couple of hundred years. I think that France and Germany have grown apart in some ways, despite the very considerable lip service that is still paid to the idea of some kind of unity between the two countries' goals. In terms of the single market, although this is clearly a very benign idea that we in Britain as well would support, after all, Britain, I must always remember this, I must always recall this to German audiences, Britain is the biggest trading partner of the monetary union bloc. So clearly we are affected by what goes on in monetary union, but that hasn't worked either, because the amount of trade that the monetary union countries do with each other now has fallen precipitously over the last 15 years. Germany does now about 36% of its trade with countries within monetary union in Europe. It does an almost equal amount with other countries in Europe that are not part of monetary union. And those countries, of course, include countries like Russia or Turkey, or Norway or Switzerland that are outside the EU. But it also includes countries like Britain or Poland or the Czech Republic or Sweden or Denmark, all perfectly respectable countries that are in the EU but not part of EU. Britain was actually Germany's biggest trading partner last year, according to the figures of the Bundesbank, even though we're not in the single currency. So this actually does show that the idea that a single currency by itself will generate a single market with lots more trade, lots more dynamism, lots more investment is a false theorem. The idea that the euro would somehow become a real rival to the dollar, that doesn't hold water either. Because clearly, for all kinds of reasons, good and bad, the Americans are still very much top dogs, and we've seen this just with the recent escapade over the American monetary and fiscal crisis. We're still back to 1971, where John Connolly, the finance minister of Richard Nixon, said is our currency and your problem. Things have not changed over that period of 40 years. And as for the Germans, this is where one of the most essential and mysterious and brilliant paradoxes comes in. The Germans clearly are top dogs in Europe, but they don't want to be. And this is a perfect recipe for deadlock. When you have a country which is widely thought of as exerting some almost demonistic power, some kind of spell that it exerts over other countries, people are obsessed, rightly I think, with Germany and the paradoxes of Germany. Germany appears to be in charge but doesn't want to be. And there is, of course, a complete lack of German leadership, but there's a complete lack of leadership in other spheres as well. So these are four enigmas at the root of the story. I will say a few words about what I think might happen next, but maybe just a few points going into this, and I think I'll colour this in with some reference also to the banking issues which both Lucia and Simon very kindly brought up. But firstly, this German business, it's my contention that it will obviously need a great deal more study and thought, that Germany has habitually been underestimated in history when its power is actually quite great, and it's been overestimated when its power is relatively minor or less than people think. And there's been this constant underestimation by foreigners of the true strength of Germany. I mentioned the issues that both President Mitterrand and Mrs. Thatcher were firmly convinced that Germany was going to go off and march all over everybody after the unification of the two parts of Germany. There was this thought that there was a new hegemon on the march in Europe. That's something that united both Thatcher and Mitterrand. I think they failed to see that Germany was going to go through a period of considerable weakness in the immediate aftermath of unification. And I have to say I did write that and predicted that myself at the time. I've always been very lucky that I always happened to be in the right place at the right time and talking to the right people. So I think my view in those days was actually correct. Germany at the beginning of the 2000s was widely thought of as being the sick man of Europe. I actually wrote in the Financial Times, I think in 1987, Germany was the slow man of Europe, which in fact it was, but I didn't think that in the early 2000s Germany was sick, because in fact I did see that Schröder, with his plans, was actually going to revitalise the German model. So at a time when the rest of the world tended to think the Germans were a bit of a basket case, I could actually see the glimmerings of some re-strengthening of Germany. And now I think Germany is hopelessly overestimated. And therefore when Mrs. Merkel says in the Bundestag, as she wrote to do not overestimate German strength, do not put too many burdens on us. I think it is not just politics. I do think that Germany is in a pretty vulnerable state. Second point is that I think the crisis is still very much with us, and I think it's by no means certain how things will pan out. I still think it's possible, indeed quite likely, that some of the weaker countries will leave over, say, the next 10 years. But the period in which this might take place, I think, has been stretched out just because of the inability of anybody in Europe to really make any firm, courageous decisions, either to give the debtor countries enough money and write off enough debt to sustain their membership, or to take, say, the gigantic decision of Germany itself leaving. There's just not enough courage or impersonance around to make any really very brave, courageous, foolhardy, adventuresome decisions. The point about the debtors and creditors, which is absolutely central to this book, and it's also, of course, a great factor in the build-up, of debt, which we, as Lucia and Simon have said, which was a banking problem in very many countries. That is with us. In fact, that's getting worse. I think if there's one metric to look at for the health of a country, also in terms of its sovereignty, and in terms of its vulnerability and its ability to be properly sovereign, one of the key metrics is certainly its net foreign creditor or net foreign debtor position. It's basically how much it owes other countries after taking off all its assets. And the net foreign debtor position of Greece and Spain and Portugal is still minus 100%, despite the immense efforts those countries have made in the last 2 or 3 years to try to adjust their balance of payments. They are now chalking up surpluses in terms of their current account, in terms of the overall balance of trade and invisible exports. And yet, despite this, the dead hand of debt is rising in all those countries. And that is simply because if your GNP or your GDP in nominal terms is growing at less than the interest rate on your debt, then your debt continues to rise as a percentage of GDP. And so despite these hugely painful, terrifyingly dismal cuts in demand that we've seen across Europe, with Greece having had a fall of something like 25% in demand over the last 5 or 6 years, Spain something like 17%, in spite of these horrendously high unemployment rates that we've seen, the debt of those countries is still inexorably rising. And the net foreign credit position of Germany is going up, according to the International Monetary Fund. It's already something like 30 to 35% of GDP. It'll be something like 75% as the Germans continue to chalk up more and more claims on other countries. And it's very interesting, if you go back to the beginning of monetary union, all those countries entered monetary union with more or less no net debt or no net credits on the clock. They started with zero, and we now have these colossal imbalances. Those imbalances, they bring succour and comfort to nobody, because it's absolutely clear that the creditors won't get their money back. And it would be far more sensible, really, for the German state, which now actually owns most of those credits on the rest of Europe. And that is because, as was rightly said, the banks sold their debt on the whole to official creditors in the run-up to the latest debt rescheduling of Greece, which was in 2012. The Germans will not get that money back. And I think it's an absolute fact that there will be a debt rescheduling, another debt rescheduling for Greece in 2014. And very influential people who should know what they're talking about have told me that's going to take place. Because the overall level of the government debt of Greece, before I was just giving you the figures for the country as a whole, after taking off their assets, their net liabilities are now something like more than 100%, but the government debt is 175% of GDP, which is totally unsustainable. So Germany, mostly now in the form of the Bundesbank, through the very convoluted mechanism under which the Bundesbank lends money to the ECB, which then lends money to Greece, the Germans will have to write off quite a lot of debt. And so it would be far more sensible for Germany actually to cash in their claims on other countries by, say, taking vouchers to go on holiday in Greece. You could actually buy a lot of Greek holidays and a lot of lovely homes on Greek islands. All the Germans could simply go out and spend the money. What has happened is that the Germans have sold a lot of cars or refrigerators and kitchen goods around Europe and have chalked up simply pieces of paper, a paper claim in a bank, and they will never get the money back. So both the creditors and the debtors, because of these huge imbalances that have been building up, will, I'm afraid, lose out. The ugly little truth here is that when the debtors get into problems, it happened with Charles Dickens, then you tend to feel sorry for the debtor. Nobody feels sorry for the creditors. So the Germans will, I'm afraid to say, go through a kind of double hit, a double tragedy, that they will have to write off quite a lot of these credits that are owed by the debtor countries, but nobody will feel sorry for them. We'll feel sorry for Italy, we'll feel sorry for Portugal, we'll feel sorry for Greece, but nobody feels sorry for the creditors. Of course, the Netherlands is an even bigger creditor than Germany, but we won't go into that. The basic tension between France and Germany, I mentioned already, both France and Germany wanted a different kind of monetary union. That hasn't been resolved. I think that is still with us. Political union, which is certainly one of the points I put forward in the final chapter, which I did, as Simon says, is a bit of an afterthought, because the English editors, they said, well, look, the book is supposed to be about how to solve the Euro crisis. You're supposed to be a bit constructive here. Why don't you come up with some plan? So I put forward this 10-point plan, knowing that it is totally unrealisable. And I do actually say it cannot be reached, at least it cannot be reached for the present membership of the monetary union. There's another little paradox here, that the Germans would be quite happy to have political union or fiscal union with countries that manifestly don't want it or don't need it. With Austria, it would be perfectly okay. It wouldn't be that much of a problem. And the countries that do want fiscal union or political union because they'd like their debts to be paid, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, the Germans would never, not in a month of Sundays, not in a year of Sundays, would a German government of any complexion sign up to that. But political union, of course, has been put forward over the ages as the essential concomitant to monetary union. And that actually just brings me to one of the points, which is, and it really came out a bit in what Simon, you were saying, that this was a colossal accident waiting to happen. Because in fact nothing that has happened has been totally unpredictable or unpredicted. Chancellor Kohl, on the eve of the Maastricht summit, he said, unless we have a political union to accompany this monetary union, it will be a castle in the air. Any number of sage people from the Bundesbank wrote that unless countries recognise that they are in a monetary union and that they can no longer make up for excessive costs or excessive imbalances by devaluing, they can only make up for those costs that get out of alignment by reducing prices at the factory gate or in terms of wages. Many, many people said this before monetary union even started. And they said that unless countries do their internal homework, so to speak, and make sure that their costs do not get out of kilter, they will suffer draconian unemployment, because that will be the only way of bringing down the imbalances. And that's exactly what has happened. So it's been perhaps more dire, and it's caused more anguish, and certainly caused bigger upheavals than would otherwise have been the case, because it's also occurred at the background of the overall world financial crisis, which is clearly linked into this one. But nonetheless, the basic story that countries that don't get their house in order will suffer and will pay for it, that's been well known. This is like a rerun of the gold standard in many ways, and we are seeing also a rerun of some of the history of the 1930s. But of course, it was relatively easy for Britain to leave the gold standard in September 1931. A bit more difficult for France. They held on for a bit longer. But it's much, much easier to get out of the gold standard, or indeed to leave the exchange rate mechanism, as Britain did in September 1992, than it is to leave the euro. And this is where the William Hague analogy of the burning house does ring true. I also use the reclus of Sartre, the three neighbours who are locked into a room, and at first they think it's really a really nice room to be spending an evening until they realise the door is locked and they will never be able to get out of that room. And there are, I'm afraid to say, some quite chilling thoughts that do lend one to a kind of existential plot of some sort. Just a couple of words right at the very end now about what might happen next. We see in Mrs. Merkel a kind of curse that has actually struck all the leading players in monetary union since the beginning. We are indeed in the church, so one would like to bring in some biblical references, but it is almost as though there has been some ugly spell placed upon some of these contenders. If you think of Chancellor Kohl, the only reason he stayed on for so long, and he well knew that he was past his sell-by date, the only reason he stayed on for 16 years was that he thought that he should be there to see the euro through. And of course he gave ground to Gerhard Schröder before the euro was actually inaugurated. And Kohl then of course was sacrificed, was burnt, was betrayed by Merkel, who then became the top dog. But it is amazing how Kohl, who's still alive, but of course is now, he cannot possibly know what's going on because he's clearly so very ill for all sorts of reasons. If you take Mitterrand, I know as a fact that on his, more or less on his deathbed, Mitterrand told a confidant that Mitterrand had made a great mistake by turning the European Central Bank into a kind of clone of the Bundesbank. The independence of the European Central Bank, Mitterrand said, was a great mistake that he had made. He died a tragically disillusioned man. He played a greater role, I think, in the story of the euro than Helmut Kohl did. But he felt that you could give away the independence of the central bank and somehow get it back. He hadn't realised that this was more or less irreversible. Dominic Strauss-Kahn, one of the great heroes de nos jours, where his hubris, where that to him, and I think Mrs. Merkel is the latest victim, because of course she has somehow managed to escape the general wrath of the lecturers throughout the last 12 years. She is the incumbent who still did win a victory after all, as we know, in the September the 22nd elections, unlike nearly every other government leader in monetary union. She was not ejected. And yet her fate, in a kind of Sartre-like feast of drama, has been again to be locked in with her worst enemies, the Social Democratic Party, who lost convincingly by 16 percentage points behind on September the 22nd. And they have the effrontery to go into coalition negotiations with their worst enemy, i.e. Mrs. Merkel, demanding their pound of flesh, otherwise they will not play ball. And so it was an intensely Pyrrhic victory, and a tragedy, actually, for Mrs. Merkel.
I haven't met David tonight, but I mean, the person you see here tonight, you know, sharp and wry and amusing, but also incisive, is exactly the author of the book. I mean, I met you on the pages of the book, and if you read the book or buy the book, you will encounter the argument and the style and the force of personality that David's offered tonight. So thank you. I mean, thank you all for coming. I want to thank Lucia and Simon for their interesting introductory talks, David for taking the trouble to come and talk to us tonight, all of you for showing